This is Al Jazeera. Adrian Finnegan here in Doha with a news hour with coverage of the most intense exchange of fire between Israel and Palestinian armed groups in years. An Israeli airstrike has hit a residential tower in Gaza City. The army says that it informed residents of Hanadi Tower to evacuate before it was targeted. Gaza's health ministry says that at least 28 Palestinians have been killed across the Strip in the past day. After the Israeli airstrike on that building, the military wing of Hamas said that it would respond with a barrage of rockets which would target Tel Aviv. That appears to be underway right now. Al Jazeera's Harry Fawcett is live for us in southern Israel. Harry, you're safe to talk to us now.
Yes, that immediate barrage of Iron Dome interceptors that we just saw and had to interrupt our live a few minutes ago is now over. But just to bring you up to date from what we've seen here, it was an exceptionally large barrage of rocket fire coming north out of northern Gaza, heading north at the same time as we were getting alerts on our phones of sirens going off in Tel Aviv, and indeed reports of explosions in the Tel Aviv area. Hamas's military wing had warned the Israelis that there would be a response. They said that Tel Aviv would see something even more powerful than what happened to the city, the nearby city here of Ashkelon earlier in the day. During that period, Hamas says that 137 rockets were fired within 5 minutes. Certainly, there was a lot of rocket fire that got through. 2 women were killed as homes were hit, buildings were hit. Now there seems to be this additional very large barrage heading towards Tel Aviv. And of course, it follows the destruction of that large residential tower inside Gaza. There had been warnings throughout the day that if Israel decided to attack residential buildings, where it had said that it had already attacked Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters in one apartment building. This building is said to have housed a Hamas office of some kind. Hamas had said that if Israel carried out such attacks, there would be a big escalatory response. So both sides are stepping up what is now an extremely dangerous situation. There is no indication of any efforts towards de-escalation at this moment.
Harry, stay with us just for a second. Let me just bring our viewer up to date with what newswires are saying right now. The Reuters news agency reporting that at least 1 person has been wounded in a rocket attack on Tel Aviv. They're quoting the Israeli ambulance service. Hamas says that it has fired 130 rockets towards Tel Aviv and its suburbs, and Israel has halted all flights at Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion airport amid that rocket fire from Gaza. Harry, that earlier barrage of 137 rockets, as you say, managed to evade Israel's Iron Dome system. At least some of the rockets fired from Gaza had got through, with another 130, Hamas saying that it's fired within the last few minutes. I suppose, it would be inevitable that some of them would reach their targets towards Tel Aviv.
Yes, I mean, I suppose we should put one caveat on that we are relying on Hamas's own figures in saying that. But yes, the sheer volume of ordnance flying overhead a few minutes ago, even if it doesn't get up to that level, it was a very significant, coordinated, very large barrage all at once. And so there has been some analysis on the Israeli side, military analysts wondering if the sheer swamping of the Iron Dome system by so many targets all at once could have caused the ability for Hamas to get through those defenses to a greater extent than usual. There have also been claims by Hamas that they've used a new form of missile, one that is fired at a more horizontal level trajectory and therefore is harder to track and hit. Also, some reports of malfunctioning Iron Dome system around Ashkelon earlier in the day. However, of course, when we're talking about the sheer volume of weaponry that is being used at the moment, I think Israelis never really believed that the Iron Dome is 100% fail-safe, and indeed it has been shown not to be in the past. However, people have got used to lower level escalations being largely, although not completely, dealt with by this extremely successful system. But if there was a reminder needed that it isn't 100% fail-safe or foolproof, this is being given tonight in pretty dramatic fashion.
And what happens to ordinary people there in Israel when something like this happens, then the air raid sirens go off? People pretty used to living with this sort of threat, but where do they go? What do they do?
Well, a lot of homes in Israel have storerooms or bedrooms which also double up as bomb shelters with heavy steel doors and various other safety mechanisms and architecture installed. And so a lot of people do head for those rooms, those safe rooms in their own houses. There are also bomb shelters at liberal intervals in most Israeli neighborhoods as well. We're very close to one here next to a bus stop at this junction. And yes, some more rockets now being fired from northern Gaza, at least one rocket I've just seen in any case. Three, I'm being told from behind the camera that there are 3 more rockets just being fired. And so in the instance of the 2 women who were killed in Ashkelon, one of them at least was said to be living in a house which didn't have its own shelter. It required a minute's run or so. She was an elderly woman, and when the rocket hit her house, she was killed in that attack.
All right, Harry. Before we go back to Gaza, yes, sorry, Harry, you were about to say.
Right now,
reports about direct hit to a bus in Holon.
I'm just being told that in central Israel, in the town of Holon, reports of a direct hit to a bus. Do we know anything about casualties at this stage? We don't know how many people were in that bus, if anybody was, but that is the latest that we're just getting through on this very significant. It's an empty bus. We're just hearing, well, okay, some reports suggesting it's an empty bus. I apologize. I just wanted to bring you the very latest on that, but this is a constantly moving situation and a very major escalation in the danger around what has already been a very dangerous day.
All right, Harry, many thanks indeed. Al Jazeera's Harry Fawcett there live in southern Israel. We want to go back to Gaza, but we're having trouble connecting with our correspondent at the moment. We'll try and get communications with him again as soon as possible. In the meantime, the Arab League has been holding an emergency meeting to discuss the escalating violence. Jordan's foreign minister has told the virtual session that Israel's aggression and its violation of international law will only fuel the conflict and push it to explosion. Qatar's foreign minister, who chaired the session, says the Israeli bombing of Gaza is a condemned and unacceptable criminal attack. And the Arab League's Secretary-General, Ahmed Aboul-Gheit, has asked the UN Security Council to act over what he called a blatant violation by Israel of international resolutions. The United Nations has appealed for all sides for restraint on all sides. So let's go live now to the United Nations. Al Jazeera's Kristen Salumi is there for us. What's the UN saying, Kristen?
Well, Adrian, in the last hour or two, we've had statements from the Secretary General and from the President of the General Assembly, but we're still not getting any word from the Security Council, which did hold an emergency meeting on Monday, but no formal statements coming from them as of yet. The President of the General Assembly, Volkan Bozkir, perhaps issuing the strongest statements from the United Nations, condemning the attacks against civilians and religious places, including recent airstrikes in Gaza. He called on Israel to abide by its obligations under international law, and he called on the UN to act immediately to get Israel to uphold those obligations and protect Palestinians, whom he said are bearing the brunt of the ongoing violence in the occupied territories and in Israel. And he said that he's willing to call a meeting if other member states are willing to ask for one. This was a statement that he released on Twitter. The Secretary General, for his part, issued a statement expressing his grave concern about the escalating violence as well, and sadness about the death of civilians. But he stopped short of condemning the attacks on Gaza. While he was very quick to condemn rocket attacks into Israel, he called on Israeli forces to use maximum restraint. Have a listen to what he said.
The Secretary General is gravely concerned by the serious escalations in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel, including the latest escalations in Gaza, which add to the heightened tensions and violence in occupied East Jerusalem. He is deeply saddened to learn of the increasingly large numbers of casualties, including children, from Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, and of Israeli fatalities from rockets launched from Gaza.
Kristen, realistically, is there anything that the UN can do to stop the violence?
All power to act comes from the Security Council, and at this stage, we cannot even get the Security Council to agree on a statement to the press about the situation there. This is traditionally a very thorny issue for the Council. We know that Russia, Norway and Tunisia yesterday suggested a statement calling for calm and an end to the violence there. This is still being discussed. The United States has said that it does not want to do anything to exacerbate the situation, suggesting that a statement might, in fact, do that, exacerbate the situation. So we are essentially at an impasse in the Security Council unless they can come to some agreement later on today. But for now, strong words from the President of the General Assembly, condemnation of attacks on Israel from the Secretary General, and wait and see what happens with the Security Council.
Kristen Salumi there, reporting live from the United Nations in New York for the moment. Kristen, thank you. You're looking at the latest pictures out of Tel Aviv. This has all happened within the last few minutes. The military wing of Hamas has said that it's fired over 130 rockets towards Tel Aviv in response to an Israeli airstrike that had flattened a tower block in the Strip. The Al-Aqsa Brigade said that we are carrying out our promise by launching a massive rocket strike against Tel Aviv and its suburbs with 130 rockets in response to the enemy's targeting of residential towers, it said. As a result, at least one person is reported to have been wounded in a rocket attack on the Tel Aviv area. The National Ambulance Service reporting that one person critically wounded. And as Harry Fawcett was telling us, it appears that a bus has been hit in these airstrikes. A barrage of rockets we saw here on Al Jazeera leaving the Gaza Strip, some of which were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. But obviously, looking at these pictures now from Israeli television, some of those projectiles have gone through and have reached their target. Let's bring in Al Jazeera's Harry Fawcett once again, who's in southern Israel. And Harry, you were able to watch those missiles going basically overhead of you there and their attempted interception by Iron Dome.
That's right, yes. Those missiles fired shortly before what at local time was coming up to 9 o'clock, and that was exactly when the warning had been that there was likely to be a surprise in Tel Aviv. That was what Hamas's military wing was talking about. And it was less than an hour after the Israeli attack on that 13-story residential building inside Gaza, the Hanadi building. They had issued warnings to the people who live in that building, the tens of families who live in that building ahead of time, to evacuate it. And it was then brought down with at least 2 strikes. Hamas had said that attacks on residential areas would be met with an intensification and longer range in terms of its rocket response. Then it said that it would attack Tel Aviv, and it has made good on that escalatory pledge, just as Israel said that it was going to increase the pace and the intensity of its own attacks. So both sides are seemingly set on an escalatory path right now. And this attack on Tel Aviv, it represents the most serious such breach of Israeli defenses in the main big city of Israel on the Mediterranean coast there, home to a very large population. And this does represent an extremely dangerous last hour in what was already the biggest escalation we've seen since the last war in 2014.
The US State Department, Harry, says that the US is deeply concerned about the escalation between Israel and those launching rockets from Gaza. It says that it's seen some encouraging steps from both the Israeli and Palestinian side. What would it take to end this violence now, to take the heat out of this at this point?
It's very difficult to see the heat being taken out anytime soon. I think a lot will depend on the casualty numbers on the Israeli and Gaza side. We've just heard that in Holon, where that bus was struck, that there were 3 injuries there. So I'm just going to ask my colleague, was that in that bus attack, or we don't know? We think perhaps not. But yes, so injuries are already being counted. If there are greater numbers of fatalities, of course, that leads further to the escalatory tendency of this whole situation. The reports we were getting out of Gaza were that Egyptian attempts to mediate had so far not been met with success. There were reports that they had been trying to persuade Hamas in the first instance to dial down the level of its rocket fire and then try and convince Israel to respond. However, neither side apparently in the mood to do those things. The build-up of tension has been going on for a month now, since the beginning of Ramadan. We have one more day of Ramadan on Wednesday before the Eid festival. And this is the kind of situation that Eid will be marked in the midst of. It has been an extraordinary couple of weeks of rising, simmering tensions, with the threat in the background always that it could spread to Gaza in this way. And it has done so, despite what the US was talking about, the decisions by Israel to not allow Jews onto the Temple Mount, as it's known to Jews, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound on Monday, to disband or change the route of the planned nationalist march through the Old City, which ended up not happening. If they were seen, though, as concessions in some way, a lot of empty trucks coming back having delivered military hardware to the Gaza border. If those moves had been seen as an attempt to try to tamp down the situation, it followed very shortly after those terrible scenes we saw on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound on Monday morning. And so already it seemed that the path had been set, and Hamas issued that warning that it was going to attack Jerusalem if there were not a withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and from the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. I think those are conditions they probably knew were not going to be likely to be met. And as soon as those long-range missiles headed in the direction of Jerusalem on Monday evening, we've been set on this path, and the decisions being made so far only seem set to take us further along it.
Harry, for the moment, many thanks. Al Jazeera's Harry Fawcett there, reporting live from southern Israel. If you've just joined us, the military wing of Hamas has said that it's fired over 130 rockets towards Tel Aviv on Tuesday evening in response to an Israeli airstrike that had destroyed a tower block in the Strip earlier. Another, well, that looked like a pretty big missile. It was different to the ones that we saw leaving the Gaza Strip in that barrage of rocket fire a little earlier. Live pictures there from Gaza. Let's bring in Al Jazeera's Safwat Al-Khalout, who's in Gaza. You probably, I don't know, you couldn't see it from where you were, Safwat, but we saw what looked like a pretty big missile being launched out of the Gaza Strip there.
Yes, as we saw earlier, even the sky of Gaza is flaming. Rockets have been fired from Gaza. longer range rockets have been fired from Gaza towards Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Tel Aviv. The Qassam brigades claimed responsibility for the attack in response to the destruction of Hanadi building. Now there are more rockets have been fired, which looks like as if they were longer range rockets, because they are flying higher than the short range. We just learned that the Israelis have warned also that they will destroy another tower, which is just the one next behind us, the red one behind us, and that people have to evacuate the building. In this building, we know about lots of media groups working there, including newspapers, TVs, and other media groups. So far, the case is that even Islamic Jihad joined the Qassam brigades and also said that they have fired their rockets towards Tel Aviv, and this is still the beginning, as they said. We are expecting more or wider range of violence, of escalation. We are expecting more buildings that could be bring down, like Hanadi one, and as we learned, that even the one behind us also will be destroyed. As still there is no confirmation, but this is the news what we have received now. We are still, the night is still in the beginning, and we are expecting that later on there will be more rockets by the Palestinian fighting groups and Israelis, which have extended their bank of targets. We are expecting them to hit more residential areas, and they even some voices say that they will move to the next step, which is targeting senior commanders of the fighting groups, and could be also some of the political figures of the Palestinian political groups.
And Safwat, we were talking to Harry Fawcett earlier about what happens to Israelis when the sirens go off and there's incoming fire from Gaza. What about the people of Gaza? Do they have anywhere to go, any shelters, anywhere to take shelter when Israel is attacking targets in the Strip?
Yes, I heard my colleague Harry when he said that they were going into shelters, but when the rockets were fired from Gaza. In Gaza, there are no shelters. The only thing that people can do is just stay in their homes. That's why when the Israelis hit any target, most of the casualties are civilian, because there is nowhere to go, no bunkers, no shelters, no places prepared for such explosions or such escalation. So the only thing people can do is just to stay home and wait for the next target, where and how and who.
Safwat, for the moment, many thanks. Safwat Al-Khatut there, live for us in Gaza City. No doubt we'll be back with you in the next few minutes, Safwat. I want to bring in Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, Marwan Bashara, who's been standing by since this all began. And has been listening and watching watching our coverage here. Marwan, we knew this was coming, wasn't it? Some kind of retaliation here after Israel struck that residential building in Gaza.
Yes, absolutely. And I was taken a bit by what I heard from our correspondents, and I think, you know, the fact that we have, and we are unique in that as Al Jazeera, having two correspondents on both sides of the so-called border, both in Gaza and Israel. That's important. But I think the important observation we just heard is that these are two very different situations. Israel is a modern, prosperous, strong nuclear power state with the most advanced air force in the region and perhaps in the world, one of the most. And Gaza is a big concentration camp of refugees that's been as such for the past 50+ years, an impoverished camp of refugees. And whatever they have in so-called missile technology is basically homemade or garage-made type of archaic, arms. And the more important observation is the one about shelters. You know, people in Gaza, 2+ million of people that have no shelters. No such thing exists. So basically, the asymmetrical nature of this conflict, if you want to call it that way, between Israel and Gaza tonight is the most important aspect of it, in the sense that there is no two sides per se. The two-sidism is a fake news, if you will, when describing what's going on in Israel and Gaza. Just look at the figures, not just this conflict. Look at what happened in 2014, 2008, 2006, and before that. There's always this disproportionately high casualties and death and destruction in Gaza in comparison to the very low injury or perhaps death in Israel. Of course, in as far as we and hopefully everyone else is concerned, any death is a very sad and tragic development. But clearly, the price that Gaza paid, that Palestinians in Gaza pay, is always much higher. And so I hope this thing stops, because Netanyahu's cynical, I would even say sadistic use of Israel's advanced weapons against the mostly unsheltered people of Gaza will lead to a lot of mayhem and destruction. But just like every other conflict that you and I and everyone else covered over the last few years and decades, we will go back to point zero, in the sense that there is no military solution to this kind of tension, to this kind of conflict, if you will. It's certainly not the occupation, and certainly not what is happening in Jerusalem. Speaking
of Prime Minister Netanyahu, Israel in political turmoil at the moment. I know from discussions we had in the previous hours here on Al Jazeera, that you have your theories as to why this escalation is happening right now.
I think there's a good number of reasons, and I think a good part of them fall in Mr. Netanyahu's lap. We've known him to be, he's widely known to be, almost a serial liar and a skillful manipulator. This is just, the wide perception in Israel itself and elsewhere. And so now that he is in a desperate situation, now that he is on trial in Israel on a number of important corruption charges that it's almost definite that he will end up in jail, like his predecessor, Ehud Olmert, unless he stays in power. So he has been doing everything possible in order to stay in power, including going to three different elections within 2 years. It's almost unheard of. Why? In order to stay in power. He is the only obstacle why there is no coalition government in Israel today after 2 years and 3 elections. So what has he been doing? He's been very busy. He's been very busy forming, uniting, and allying with the most radical, fanatic Israelis. And these are the Jewish Zionist Party that actually ended up with 6 seats in the present Israeli parliament. They are Mr. Netanyahu's allies. They are the ones Mr. Netanyahu has been covering for as they have escalated the tensions in East Jerusalem. They are the ones behind much of the tension that has been going on in East Jerusalem for the last several weeks and, in fact, months and years. Those very radical fanatics think that without them taking over fully and evacuating the Palestinians from the city, there will be no peace and no Jewish state. So what we have here is now Netanyahu is encouraging these people to do this sort of escalation in East Jerusalem, leading to the response that we've seen on the part of Hamas and others saying, look, if you're going to continue strangling Jerusalem, if you're going to continue besieging Al-Aqsa Mosque, we as Hamas, we as the Palestinian leaders, we're going to retaliate. And hence, Netanyahu, in fact, jumped on the occasion, because the last thing he wants is the focus in Jerusalem. He loves the fact that the focus can now shift away from Jerusalem, from the popular, peaceful resistance in Jerusalem, to the kind of retaliation and counter relations against Gaza. That also allows him to build or the kind of support within Israel for perhaps a national emergency government. He did that before, by the way. And that will also give him a chance to deny the competition within Israel, like the Atid party and the Yair Lapid's of the Israeli political system, to form an alternative coalition government. So I think, to a large degree, Prime Minister Netanyahu is using this unfolding tragedy in order to remain in power. Whether he succeeds or not, of course, is another story. But for the time being, this is the story. The story is that why now? Why the escalation? Why the tragedy? Well, because there is this one man that wants to maintain power in the country, and that is Benjamin Netanyahu.
Marwan, for the moment, many thanks. Stay with us. We'll be back with you a little later. Our senior political analyst, Marwan Bashara, there, live in Doha. It's just after 1:30. This is Al Jazeera with continuing coverage of the latest developments from Gaza and Israel. Hamas says that it's fired 130 more rockets from Gaza towards Tel Aviv in Israel. The Israeli ambulance service says that one person has been critically wounded in a rocket attack there. And that latest barrage of rockets has forced Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion airport to suspend all flights. These are the latest pictures from Israel you're looking at right now from the Tel Aviv area. Let's bring in William Shabas, who's a professor of international law at Middlesex University in London and a former chairperson of the Commission of Inquiry on the 2014 Gaza conflict. He joins us now live via Skype from London. Professor, thank you for being with us. I know you've been waiting for some time before we've got to you. Your thoughts on this conflict, which now appears to be spiraling into something much bigger?
Well, the military side of it, we have a sense of déjà vu. We know that there are going to be huge amounts of Palestinian casualties, great damage to the infrastructure in Gaza. As your commentator said a few minutes ago, this is a very lopsided military engagement. But it all has to go back to the spark that began this latest phase in the conflict, which is the dispute about East Jerusalem and the attempts. One has there the feeling that the seizure of land from Palestine, the creation of refugees, Palestinian refugees, which goes back to the late 1940s, is unfinished business still for the people in power in Israel. And so this is all about trying to take homes away from Palestinians and moving them out. And the result, of course, has been a great deal of violence in Jerusalem, fury of the Palestinians who are terribly frustrated and angered by all of this, and now this terrible military escalation. We'll have to see when the smoke clears how much of the laws of war have been observed by both sides. But what we do know is that there's going to be huge suffering among innocent Palestinians, children, non-combatants, as there has been in all of the previous conflicts in Gaza.
You talk about responsibility for a lot of what's happening lying with Israel's political leaders, but to what extent does it also lie with the former American administration, the Trump administration? And what does the Biden administration have to do now to be able to take the heat out of this, to be able to help to solve the situation?
Well, just about a year ago, the Trump administration took a very dramatic step by, in effect, breaking with the position it had had. It had been part of a fairly unanimous view around the world, with the exception of Israel, that the West Bank and East Jerusalem were occupied territory, and that it ultimately had to be restored to Palestinian control, that this was a temporary situation, and it was governed by the Fourth Geneva Convention, which means no settlements, no transfer of settlers into the occupied territory. And the Trump administration broke with that about a year ago. It was not followed by other countries around the world, so that it was just, this was Trump's theory about how to rearrange the chessboard, really. And the Biden administration should go back on all of that. They should set the clock back to where the U.S. position was over a year ago. What Trump did was he emboldened Netanyahu, and he emboldened the whole idea that more territory could be taken from the Palestinians, that more Palestinians could be kicked out of their homes, deprived of their livelihood, and the part that at some point or another will be deemed sovereign territory of Israel will be expanded.
You probably heard Marwan saying a few moments ago that there is no military solution to this conflict. Where does the UN stand in all of this? Its position has always been the two-state solution. Is that, given all that is currently going on, the politics of Israel at the moment, is that still a viable solution?
I think it has to be. I mean, if there's one state, then the Palestinians have to be treated equally as they are in all modern democracies. They have to be free of discrimination. They have to have freedom of movement within the territory of a single state. Israel certainly doesn't want that, but that's what they would have to do. The alternative is recognition of Palestinian self-determination and the right for Palestine to have its own secure borders. This is either one can bring peace, actually, either solution. But the UN has been faithful to the vision that goes back to the 1940s of a two-state solution, and I think that's still widely shared within Israel and Palestine. But if there is a move, as Israel seems to be pushing for what we call one hegemonic state that will absorb parts of the occupied territories, they cannot do that without full recognition of all of the rights of Palestinians within the entire territory. And they don't have that. What they have, Human Rights Watch said it a few weeks ago, is an apartheid state, like South Africa. And we saw where that led. It's not viable in the long run, regardless of military solutions. And we know that the South Africans tried military solutions with the black population in South Africa too. And none of that worked. Ultimately, they had to recognize a system of democracy and equal rights and non-discrimination for everybody. That has to be the way forward.